We have seen how circuits composed of transistors can be used to implement addition and other algebra for any number with arbitrary binary digits or bits. If you want to build a computer, we would have to choose exactly how many electrical tracks and gates to have available for representing a number. This is like when you're filling in a form and it has a set number of boxes physically printed on it for putting in your age. For commercial computers, this is always a multiple of 8. 8 bits are called a byte. The computer will have adder circuits and so on of the types I described in the last section, which take 1 byte or 8-bit numbers, 2 byte or 16-bit numbers, 4 byte or 32-bit numbers as inputs. No matter of how many bytes a number is comprised, one of its bits can be set aside to denote a plus or minus sign. When a number is signed in this way, if the leading bit is 0, then the number is positive. If the leading bit is 1, then the number is negative. As anyone who has ever taken a mathematics exam knows, it's important to store your workings. Whichever operation a computer undertakes, the inputs and outputs must be somehow stored. To do this, a type of circuit called a latch is used. Once it has latched, it will stay that way for a long time and can therefore be used to store a bit of data. 8 latches store a byte and so on. This is an example of what's called a D-latch, comprised of NAND gates. You may notice that this looks rather strange. Before, we have seen gates in a strictly sequential manner, where the output of one gate goes directly to another. Now, there is an output from one going to the input of another, but then the output comes right back. It is this kind of interconnection that allows this network of gates to hold and retain its output value, 0 or 1. Nothing will change unless the E or enable input is 1. When enable is 1, whatever bit is applied to D will propagate to the output. The computer will carry out an operation, addition for example, enable a bunch of latch circuits to store the output, and then switch the enable back off. The result will then be held there as long as is required. 8 of these latches can form a register which will store a byte of data as long as it's required. An add circuit of the type we looked at in the previous section would have such registers to store the inputs before the addition takes place, and a register to capture the result of the addition. It takes some small but significant amount of time for electrical signals to propagate, for transistors to finish switching and so on, to guarantee that the operation is fully carried out before attempting to read out the answer. All computers have a clock. In basic terms, an oscillating crystal switches a voltage on and off at a very specific rate. At the time when this video is made, computer processors have typical clock speeds of 2 GHz, meaning that the clock switches at 2 billion times a second. The regular switching allows events to be synchronized. To fully carry out an addition operation, it would take at least 3 clock cycles. On the first clock cycle, numbers would be loaded into the input registers. Then, the addition circuit can work over the next clock cycle. Finally, on the third clock cycle, the output register gets an enable signal and stores the result. Actually, most operations take much longer than 1 or even 3 clock cycles to carry out. We have seen in the previous section that multiplication takes several adding steps to accomplish. Nonetheless, whether it takes 1 or 100 cycles, the clock is still used to synchronize when an operation begins until the output is ready. All the so-called arithmetic logic, that is, all the arrays of logic gates which do addition and subtraction, is physically located together with the registers on a chip called the processor or central processing unit. There are also circuits in there called the cache, which nowadays can store tens of kilobytes of data as the intermediate stages of calculations, for example. There is a need for a larger and longer-term way to store many more bytes of data than the registers and the cache. Computers have separate physical chips of random access memory or RAM, which makes use of capacitors to store this data. If a capacitor is charged, it has a high voltage and therefore a value of 1. If it's discharged, it has 0 volts relative to ground and so is 0. The charge leaks or is lost over time, but is topped up by the memory circuits as long as the computer is powered. A typical laptop computer has tens of gigabytes or billions of bytes of RAM. Every byte stored in RAM has its own address, like a postbox in an apartment block. The address is itself a binary number. The RAM has many transistors forming gate networks which ensure that when it receives the address in binary format from the processor, it then returns the byte stored at that address. Until recently, computers wouldn't usually have more than 4 gigabytes of RAM. Each of those bytes requires a unique address, so memory addresses were 32-bit numbers. Such 32-bit numbers go up to just over 4 billion, so that used to be fine. When RAM got bigger, there effectively weren't enough addresses, so now 64-bit numbers are used for memory addresses. This is the difference between 32 and 64-bit programs. So let's say you're playing a video game where you have a number of coins in your wallet. The video game will keep track of the address where the wallet total is stored. If you found 8 more coins, the game will fetch the number currently in your wallet from that address, load it into the register, load a binary number corresponding to 8 and base 10 into the other register, add them together and put the result back into the address with the wallet total. We will look at this in more detail in the next section. Computers also store huge volumes of data on hard disk for decades at a time, even without power. A hard disk is covered in tiny magnetic domains, which can point up or down, corresponding to 1 or 0. As the disk spins, a sensor head can either passively read off the orientation of the magnets as bits, or actively flip the orientation of the magnetic domains to write data onto the disk. Each of the bytes also has its own separate address. A laptop or personal computer can store hundreds of gigabytes on a hard disk. There are other technologies like flash memory, DVDs and so on that I won't go into here. The fundamental limit on how fast a computer can do operations is the speed of light, which can go about 15 centimeters or half a foot during a typical computer clock cycle. So it would take multiple cycles for a computer larger than that to fetch any data. Realistically, transistors switch much slower than that, while a hard disk takes time to spin up and scan to read the data. In terms of types of computer memory, the cache is small but quick to access. The RAM stores many more bytes of data but takes longer to read. The hard disk takes the longest to read but stores a lot of data almost permanently. So there is a trade-off between how quickly the data can be retrieved and how much can be stored. From now on in this video, I will explain things as if the computer just has a single pool of memory which it can instantly read. In reality, things are more complicated as I've just described. To summarize, computers have a clock which synchronizes the operations being performed and ensures that there is enough time to finish performing one operation before starting another. Computers process binary numbers in groups of 8 bits called a byte. Registers are used to store numbers during computations, and at other times numbers are stored in the cache, in random access memory, and on a hard disk. Each byte in memory has its own unique address, which is itself a binary number.